There were country songs in the 1960s that every American could sing word for word. They came out of kitchen radios and pickup truck cabs. They sold millions of copies. They sat at number one for months at a time. Then radio quietly stopped playing them, and nobody noticed the day it ended. These 25 country songs every American grew up listening to and then stopped hearing. Subscribe before we start so you don't miss any of our lookbacks. Number 25, The Wild Side of Life, Hank Thompson, 1952. This was the biggest country record in America that year. Not one of the biggest. The biggest. It sat at number one for 15 straight weeks, and when Billboard added up the year, it topped both the retail sales chart and the jukebox chart. Hank Thompson sang it in a smooth Texas swing voice over a melody so old that Roy Acuff and the Carter family had both used it before him. Every honky-tonk in the country had it on the box. But the song made a claim it could not defend. It blamed a woman for walking out, and it said God had never meant her for a wife. Within months, a Nashville housewife named Kitty Wells recorded an answer to it, and her answer went to number one, too. Today, almost everybody knows the answer song. Almost nobody knows the record that provoked it. Hank Thompson wrote the question that country music is still arguing about, and the argument outlived the question. Number 24, Once a Day, Connie Smith, 1964. A year before she made this record, Connie Smith was a 22-year-old homemaker in Ohio. She entered a talent contest at a country music park, sang a Gene Shepard song, and won first place and 5 silver dollars. One of the judges was Bill Anderson. He wrote her a song about a woman who has finally worn her heartbreak down to a single scheduled hour a day, and he said he got her into RCA Studio B in Nashville to cut it. It went to number one and stayed there for 8 weeks. She became the first woman in country music history to top the chart with her debut single, and her 8-week run was the longest any woman would hold the top spot for the next 48 years. Taylor Swift finally broke that record in 2012. The Library of Congress has since put the recording in the National Recording Registry, and still, if you say her name in a room today, most people will not know it. Number 23, Girl on the Billboard, Del Reeves, 1965. There was a stretch in the 60s when the American truck driver became a folk hero, and this was one of the records that put him there. A driver hauling freight through the night keeps passing the same painted woman on the same roadside sign, and he cannot get her out of his head. Del Reeves sang it with a grin in his voice, half novelty, half genuine loneliness, and it became the only number one record of his career. Reeves spent the decades afterward as one of the most beloved performers on the Grand Ole Opry, a mimic and a comedian who could do impressions of half of Nashville. He worked constantly. He was on television. Audiences adored him. But the hits stopped, and a man known for making other people laugh rarely gets remembered as a serious part of the story. The Billboard came down, and so did he. Number 22, Saginaw, Michigan, Lefty Frizzell, 1964. This is a revenge story disguised as a love song. A poor fisherman's son wants to marry a rich man's daughter, gets refused, sails to Alaska, and comes home with a fake gold claim to sell to the father who humiliated him. Country music had never been shy about telling stories, but this one had the shape of a short film, and Lefty Frizzell sang it with the sly, sliding phrasing that every singer of his generation stole from him. It went to number one and earned him a Grammy nomination. It was also the 6th and final number one of his life. Bill Anderson wrote it, along with a man named Don Wayne, whose name will come up again before this list is over. Frizzell was 36 when he made it, and he was dead at 47. The most imitated voice in country music had one last great record in him, and this was it. Number 21, Please Help Me, I'm Falling, Hank Locklin, 1960. 14 weeks at number one, 9 months on the country chart, number 8 on the pop chart in America, and number 9 in Britain. By any measure you choose, this was one of the defining records of 1960, a plea from a married man who feels himself sliding toward a woman who is not his wife, sung in a high, clear tenor over Chet Atkins' production so smooth it practically glows. The song was so big that it generated its own answer record. Skeeter Davis cut a reply from the woman's point of view, and hers went to number 2. Hank Lachlan stayed at the Opry for nearly 50 years and kept working until he was 90, releasing his 65th album late in life. He never had another hit like it. Neither did most people. 14 weeks at number 1 is a mountain, and the man who climbed it has all but vanished from the view. Number 20, 6 Days on the Road, Dave Dudley, 1963. If one record built the trucking song into a genre of its own, this is the one. It was cut in Minneapolis, not Nashville, and released on a label so small most people had never heard of it. The guitar hits like a diesel pulling a grade. Dave Dudley sang it as a man counting down the miles to home, and the American long-haul driver adopted it as an anthem on the spot. It peaked at number 2, which is the strange part, because everybody remembers it as a number 1. It also carried a line that should never have gotten past radio in 1963, an admission that the driver has been taking little white pills to keep his eyes open. Nobody stopped it. The song was too good and the truth was too obvious. Every trucking record made in the following 20 years is standing on top of this one. Number 19, Abilene, George Hamilton IV, 1963. Some records work by turning the volume down instead of up. Abilene is barely more than a soft guitar figure, a gentle shuffle, and a man missing a town in Texas he is not going back to. George Hamilton IV sang it with almost no force at all, which is exactly why it worked. Chet Atkins produced it. John D. Loudermilk helped write it. It went to number 1 for 4 weeks and crossed over to number 15 on the pop chart. Hamilton went on to become one of country music's great ambassadors, the first country artist to tour behind the Iron Curtain, a man who carried the music into Britain and Canada and Czechoslovakia when nobody else was bothering. He built bridges for a genre that never quite built one back. His signature song still sounds like homesickness itself, and hardly anyone under 60 has heard it. Number 18, May the Bird of Paradise Fly Up Your Nose, Little Jimmy Dickens, 1965. He stood 4 feet 11 inches tall in boots, wore rhinestone suits cut for a man half his size, and had been making records for 16 years without ever reaching the top. Then he cut a piece of absolute nonsense about wishing a series of increasingly ridiculous misfortunes on somebody who had it coming, and it went to number 1 on the country chart and climbed the pop chart too. It was the only number 1 record of his entire life, and it arrived when he was 44 years old. Little Jimmy Dickens spent more than 60 years as a member of the Grand Ole Opry, walking out in his suits to tell jokes and sing, the shortest man on the stage and often the funniest. He became a mascot for an institution, and a mascot, however beloved, is not the same thing as a star, which is what he actually was. Number 17, Country Bumpkin, Cal Smith, 1974. 3 verses, that is the whole record. A rough man walks into a bar and a woman calls him a country bumpkin. Second verse, she is giving birth to his son and calls him the same thing through tears. Third verse, she is dying, 40 years on, and says it one last time. Nothing else happens. Nobody raises their voice. It is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of writing country music ever produced. It only held number 1 for a single week, which tells you almost nothing, because both the Country Music Association and the Academy of Country Music named it Song of the Year. Cal Smith had spent years as a guitarist in Ernest Tubbs' band before he ever sang lead, and Don Wayne wrote it, the same man behind Saginaw, Michigan. 2 of the finest story songs of the era came from a writer whose name almost nobody can tell you. Number 16, Almost Persuaded, David Houston, 1966. A married man is in a bar with a beautiful stranger. They dance. He is very close to going through with it. Then he catches the reflection of his own wedding ring in her eyes, and he stops. That is the entire story, and it held number 1 for 9 weeks, longer than any country record had managed in years. It won 2 Grammys and got nominated for Record of the Year, losing to Frank Sinatra. Here is what almost happened instead. The song was written as a possible B-side. Billy Sherrill and Glenn Sutton knocked it out as filler, and only moved it to the A side when they realized what they had. Cheryl then used its exact template to build the records that made Tammy Wynette and George Jones into legends. The blueprint for an entire era of Nashville started life as the throwaway side of somebody else's single. Subscribe now if you're enjoying this. The biggest records are still ahead. Number 15, Walk On By, Leroy Van Dyke, 1961. 19 weeks at number 1, not 9, 19. It stayed on the country chart for 37 weeks and went to number 5 on the pop chart, and in 1994, when Billboard marked its 100th anniversary and calculated the biggest country single ever released, this is the record that won. By sales, by airplay, by weeks on the chart, no country song had ever done more. That record stood for 51 years. Nothing touched it until Florida Georgia Line finally passed it in 2013. And here is the detail that should stop you. Walk On By was the B-side. It was pressed on the back of a ballad called My World Is Caving In, and somebody flipped it over. The single most successful country record in the history of the format was an afterthought. And today you would struggle to find one person in 100 who can hum it. Number 14, Detroit City, Bobby Bare, 1963. By day I make the cars, by night I make the bars. That is the line, and every Southerner who had gone north for factory work heard their own life in it. The song is about a man in Michigan writing letters home full of lies about how well he is doing when all he wants is to go back. Mel Tillis helped write it. Chet Atkins produced it. Bobby Bare sang it like a man who had done it. It won the Grammy for Best Country and Western Recording, and it only reached number 6 on the country chart, which is a reminder that chart position and importance are two different things entirely. This record documented one of the largest internal migrations in American history, millions of people who left the South and never stopped aching for it. It is a piece of national testimony, and it has quietly slipped out of the canon. Number 13, Wolverton Mountain, Claude King, 1962. There really was a mountain, and there really was a man on it. Clifton Clowers lived on Wolverton Mountain in Arkansas, about 50 miles north of Little Rock, and he was the uncle of the songwriter Merle Kilgore. The song turned him into a legend, a father so handy with a knife and a gun that no young man dared come up the hill for his daughter. People started driving out there to see if he was real. He was. The record spent 9 weeks at number 1, stayed on the chart for 26 weeks, and Billboard named it the top country record of the entire year. It went to number 6 on the pop chart as well. Claude King had come out of the Louisiana Hayride, the same Saturday night show that launched Elvis Presley and Hank Williams. He lived to 90. The mountain is still there. The song is not. Number 12, Skip a Rope, Henson Cargill, 1968. Country radio in 1968 was not in the habit of playing records about racism. This one got through by hiding inside a children's rhyme. You hear kids chanting a skipping song in a schoolyard, and the words they are chanting are the things they have picked up at home. Cheat on your taxes, hate your neighbor, daddy is stepping out, and mama is drinking about it. The children are only repeating what the adults taught them. Henson Cargill sang it flat and plain, with no outrage in his voice at all, which made it land harder. It went to number 1 on the country chart and stayed there, and it was the only number 1 record of his career. He was an Oklahoma rancher's son who never really wanted the machine that came with a hit. Country music has always been braver than its reputation, and this record is the proof, sitting in a corner where hardly anybody looks anymore. Number 11, Teddy Bear, Red Sovane, 1976. Red Sovane did not sing this record. He talked it. A trucker picks up a voice on his CB radio, a little boy whose father drove a rig and was killed on the road, and who now sits in a wheelchair talking to strangers on his daddy's old set because it is the only company he has. Then the trucker calls it in, and rigs start pulling off the highway from every direction to give the boy a ride. It went to number 1, sold over 1 million copies, and grown men who had never cried at a song in their lives pulled onto the shoulder to get through it. Sovane had built a whole career on these recitations, Giddy Up Go and Phantom 309 before it. Critics called it manipulative. Truck drivers called it the truth. He died 4 years later at the wheel of his own vehicle in Nashville, which is a fact almost nobody remembers about a record almost nobody plays. Number 10, Rose Garden, Lynn Anderson, 1970. This was recorded almost by accident. There was time left at the end of a session, and somebody suggested filling it with a Joe South song that had already been cut by 3 or 4 men and gone nowhere. The producer, who was also Anderson's husband, thought it was too masculine for a woman to sing. She disagreed and cut it anyway. Then a Columbia executive heard it and insisted it go out as a single in both markets. 5 weeks at number 1 on the country chart, number 3 on the pop chart, a Grammy, a Country Music Association award for Female Vocalist of the Year, and hit status in more than a dozen countries around the world. The album stayed the biggest selling record by a woman in country music for 27 years. Lynn Anderson was the first woman in country to sell out Madison Square Garden, and the whole thing started as filler at the end of a Tuesday. Number 9, The Three Bells, The Browns, 1959. 3 siblings from Arkansas, Jim Ed Brown and his sisters Maxine and Bonnie, took a French song that Edith Piaf had made famous in Paris and turned it into one of the most haunting records America produced that year. It follows one man, Jimmy Brown, through his entire life in 3 verses. The church bell rings when he is born. It rings when he marries. It rings when he is buried. That is the whole song. It went to number 1 on the country chart and number 1 on the pop chart, which almost nothing did in 1959, and it did it with nothing but 3 voices and a whisper of guitar. The Browns sang in a blend so tight that other harmony groups studied it for decades. Jim Ed Brown went on to a long solo career and a place in the Country Music Hall of Fame. The record that carried all 3 of them there has slipped almost entirely out of earshot. Number 8, Young Love, Sonny James, 1957. Rock and roll was tearing through American radio in 1957, and country music was losing a generation to it. Then a soft-spoken Alabama fiddle prodigy named Sonny James cut a gentle ballad about being young and in love, and it went to number 1 on the country chart and number 1 on the pop chart at the same time. A country singer had just beaten rock and roll at its own game. They called him the Southern Gentleman, and what followed is one of the most absurd statistics in American music. Starting in 1967, Sonny James put 16 singles in a row at number 1 on the country chart. 16. Consecutively. No arguments, no gimmicks, no scandal, just a man quietly making hit after hit for years. It is the kind of run that should have made him a household name forever, and instead, he is a trivia answer. Number 7. Convoy, C.W. McCall, 1975. Here is the strangest fact on this entire list. C.W. McCall was not a person. He was a character invented by an advertising executive in Omaha named Bill Fries for a series of television commercials selling bread. The commercials were so popular that people called the stations asking when they would air again. So Fries and a jingle writer named Chip Davis made a record as the character, in trucker slang, over Citizens' band Radio Chatter. It went to number 1 on the country chart for 6 weeks and number 1 on the pop chart, and it set off a nationwide CB radio craze that put phrases like 10-4 into everyday American speech. Sam Peckinpah made a movie out of it. Chip Davis, the man who wrote the music, went on to found Mannheim Steamroller. Bill Fries retired to a small Colorado town and got himself elected mayor. A bread commercial became one of the biggest records of the decade, and then it evaporated. Number 6. Honey, Bobby Goldsboro, 1968. A songwriter named Bobby Russell looked out at his front yard, noticed how much the tree he planted had grown, and wrote a song about a man whose young wife has died. Bobby Goldsboro thought it was too sentimental. He recorded it anyway. It sold 1 million copies in 3 weeks, the fastest-selling record in the history of United Artists, and it went to number 1 on the pop chart for 5 weeks and number 1 on the country chart as well. By the end of the year, it was the biggest-selling record in the world. The Country Music Association named it Song of the Year. And here is the part that makes it interesting. Critics have hated it ever since. It turns up regularly on lists of the worst songs ever recorded, mocked for being maudlin and manipulative. The biggest record on earth in 1968 is now remembered mainly by people who want to make fun of it. Number 5. 16 Tons, Tennessee, Ernie Ford, 1955. Merle Travis wrote this in 1946 about the coal country his family came from in Kentucky, where miners were paid in company scrip and owed their souls to the company store. 9 years later, Tennessee Ernie Ford was exhausted, sick of the business, and being threatened with a lawsuit by Capitol Records if he did not deliver another record. He cut this one to fulfill the contract so he could walk away. It was released as the B-side. Disc jockeys flipped it over. It went to number 1 on the country chart for 10 weeks and number 1 on the pop chart for 8, and the finger snapping you hear on it was an accident that nobody bothered to fix. It made Ford a television star with 5 years on NBC. A protest song about debt slavery, cut under duress by a man trying to quit, became one of the defining American records of the decade. Number 4. Big Bad John, Jimmy Dean, 1961. A giant of a man works a coal mine, says almost nothing to anybody, and when the timbers give way, he holds up a sagging beam with his own back so 20 other men can crawl out. Then the mine takes him. Jimmy Dean half sang and half spoke it over a hammer striking an anvil, and it went to number 1 on the pop chart and number 1 on the country chart, and won him a Grammy. Now here's what happened to Jimmy Dean. He hosted a network television show. He gave Roger Miller and Patsy Cline national exposure. He put a puppet named Rolf on television and made Jim Henson famous. And then he started a sausage company and put his own face on the package. And that is the only reason most Americans under 60 know his name today. The man had a number 1 record in 2 formats and a Grammy on the shelf, and he is remembered at the breakfast counter. Number 3, Harper Valley PTA, Jeannie C. Riley, 1968. A widow in a small town gets a note from the Parent-Teacher Association telling her that her dresses are too short and she drinks too much and she keeps company with men. So she walks into their next meeting and reads out one by one exactly what every person in that room has been doing behind closed doors. Tom T. Hall wrote it. He had been reading Sinclair Lewis, and it shows. Jeannie C. Riley was working as a secretary in Nashville when she cut it. It jumped from number 81 to number 7 on the chart in a single week, the biggest leap anybody had ever seen. It sold 6 million copies. It won a Grammy and the Country Music Association Single of the Year, and it made her the first woman ever to top both the country and the pop charts with the same song. No woman did it again until Dolly Parton 13 years later. Number 2, Ode to Billie Joe, Bobby Gentry, 1967. A family sits down to dinner in Mississippi, and the mother mentions, between passing the biscuits, that Billie Joe McAllister jumped off the Tallahatchie Bridge. Nobody stops eating. The song never tells you why he jumped, and it never tells you what the narrator and Billie Joe threw off that bridge, and Bobby Gentry refused for the rest of her life to explain either one. It was recorded as the B-side. Capitol flipped it the day after they added the strings. It went to number 1 on the pop chart for 4 weeks and knocked the Beatles out of the top spot, and her album pushed Sgt. Pepper off number 1 as well. She won a Grammy for Best New Artist. And then, at the height of everything, Bobby Gentry simply stopped. She walked away from public life in the early 80s and has given no interviews since. The song about a secret was made by a woman who became one. Number 1, The Battle of New Orleans, Johnny Horton, 1959. This was not the biggest country song of 1959, it was the biggest song in America. Billboard ranked it the number 1 record of the entire year across every genre in the middle of the rock and roll explosion. It held number 1 on the country chart for 10 weeks and number 1 on the pop chart for 6. It won 2 Grammy Awards. When Billboard later ranked the top songs of the Hot 100's first 50 years, it came in 28th overall, and it remains the highest placing country record in the history of that chart. An Arkansas high school principal named Jimmy Driftwood wrote it to teach his students about the War of 1812. Johnny Horton had married Billie Jean Jones, the widow of Hank Williams. In November of 1960, barely a year after the biggest record in America, Horton played a show at the Skyline Club in Austin, the last venue Hank Williams ever played, drove away into the night and was killed head-on by a drunk driver. He was 35. There you have it. Every song you loved. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and watch the next video above.